Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to share an incredible story with you, a tale of courage, resilience, and standing up against injustice. It's about a U.S. Army colonel, Sarah Johnson, who found herself being harassed by a police officer who thought he could get away with using his authority to intimidate her. But what happens when the tables turn and the true strength of a person is revealed? You'll definitely want to stick around to find out how this story unfolds, because there's a powerful lesson about accountability and standing your ground. By watching this video, you'll not only be inspired by Sarah's bravery, but you'll also get a glimpse into how far someone can go when they believe in what's right, no matter the odds. You'll see how one individual can make a huge difference in the face of adversity. If you have a similar story, or if something about today's video resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Drop your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're new here so you never miss out on more empowering stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and let's dive into today's story. It was a calm afternoon in Brookwood, Georgia, as Colonel Sarah Johnson, a U.S. Army officer, drove home after a military function honoring veterans. She was in civilian clothes, a navy blazer over a white blouse, slacks, with her military uniform safely folded in a garment bag next to her. The drive was peaceful, the gentle hum of her tires on the road offering a rare moment of relaxation. As Sarah looked in her rearview mirror, she noticed flashing red and blue lights rapidly closing in behind her. She hadn't broken any laws, wasn't speeding, and had been driving steadily. A slight sigh escaped her lips as she moved to the shoulder of the highway, preparing for the usual stop. The officer approached her window, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was tall, with a stiff posture and a gleaming badge. But as he looked at her, something about his expression unsettled her. It wasn't professional or curious, but condescending. Sarah kept her hands visible on the wheel, trying to stay calm. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his voice sharp. Sarah passed her driver's license to him. "Is there a problem, officer?" He barely glanced at it before his eyes flicked back to her, scanning her face. "Step out of the vehicle." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel, confused. "Excuse me? Why exactly am I being stopped?" she asked, keeping her tone steady. "I wasn't speeding or swerving. I'm well within my lane. What's the reason?" The officer smirked. "Suspicious activity," he said dismissively. "Step out now." Sarah exhaled and opened the door slowly, stepping out with her hands visible. The officer circled her vehicle, peering inside before focusing on her again. "Where are you headed?" he asked, a sneer in his voice. "Home," Sarah replied calmly. "I just left a military event." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Military, huh?" he mocked, a chuckle escaping his lips. "And what exactly are you claiming to be?" Without hesitation, Sarah lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. "I'm Colonel Sarah Johnson, United States Army." He laughed again, clearly disbelieving. "Oh, really? Colonel, huh? You sure about that?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Yes." The officer's smirk deepened. "Where's your military ID?" At that moment, Sarah realized she had left her ID in her uniform, which was in her base locker. She kept calm and responded, "I don't have it with me. It's in my uniform, which is secured at my base locker." He scoffed, clearly skeptical. "Uh-huh. Funny, huh? A colonel with no proof." Sarah didn't let her frustration show. "You're welcome to check my vehicle registration. It's in the glove compartment." The officer sneered, dismissing her words. "I'll be checking more than that," he muttered as he stepped toward her SUV. "Wait," Sarah said firmly. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle." With a smirk, he shrugged off her objection. "Suspicious behavior's enough for me," he said, his attitude dripping with condescension. "And I gotta say, you're acting real nervous." Sarah stood firm, feeling the tension in the air. The officer's attitude was becoming more hostile by the second. She knew better than to engage in a heated argument on the side of a lonely highway with no witnesses. With her military training, she knew how to stay composed under pressure. But the officer's demeanor was pushing the limits of her patience. "You're acting real suspicious," the officer repeated, his eyes scanning her every move, as if he were waiting for her to make a mistake. "You're not doing yourself any favors by acting like this." Sarah refused to let him bait her into a reaction. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. Her breath was even, her stance unwavering. "Officer," she said calmly, "I haven't done anything wrong. There's no reason for this stop, and I'm not going to let you intimidate me into doing something I don't need to do." The officer's smile widened into a sneer. He wasn't used to being challenged. In his mind, the badge and the uniform gave him power, a power that he seemed eager to assert over Sarah. But she wasn't like the other drivers he had pulled over. She wasn't afraid of him, and that, more than anything, seemed to infuriate him. "Get in the car," he ordered, his voice growing more insistent. "No," Sarah replied evenly, her voice firm. "I've already complied with everything you've asked me to. I don't need to get in your car." The officer's face reddened, his grip tightening on the radio at his side. "You're refusing a lawful order," he spat, his eyes narrowing. "Refusing to comply with an officer's request is a serious offense. It'll only make things worse for you." Sarah kept her composure. She had been in situations much more dangerous than this, but the officer's attempt to intimidate her was nothing more than a game for him. He was trying to provoke her, waiting for her to make a mistake so he could escalate the situation. "I know my rights, officer," she said calmly, her voice unwavering. "I'm not refusing anything. I'm simply asking for a lawful reason for this stop. If you don't have one, you don't have the right to detain me or search my vehicle." For a brief moment, the officer hesitated. The look in Sarah's eyes was unyielding, and he realized she wasn't like the others he had dealt with. But his arrogance soon took over, and he decided to double down on his intimidation. He reached for his radio, his voice filled with self-righteousness as he called for backup. "I need a 1029 at my location. Possible suspect. Backup needed." Sarah's pulse quickened as she mentally prepared for what could come next. She knew this was not just a simple traffic stop. This officer was deliberately escalating the situation. The more he pushed, the more she felt the need to stand her ground. A few minutes passed, and soon enough, another patrol car arrived. The officer who had pulled her over looked back at Sarah, his smirk returning. He was enjoying this, relishing in the power he thought he still held. As the backup officer approached, Sarah didn't flinch. She knew exactly how this would play out. The backup officer, a tall man with a strong presence, walked up to the first officer and exchanged a few words. They both turned to look at Sarah, sizing her up. "What seems to be the problem here?" the backup officer asked, his tone slightly more neutral than his colleagues. The first officer responded, his voice laced with condescension. "This woman's acting suspicious, won't cooperate. I need backup to search her vehicle." Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that this was her moment to regain control. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle," she said, her voice steady and firm. "You're violating my rights, and you know it." The backup officer seemed to consider this for a moment, but the first officer was quick to push forward. "We'll see about that," he muttered, clearly agitated. He motioned for Sarah to step aside, clearly planning to escalate things further. But Sarah wasn't having it. She was done playing by his rules. With her hands still in plain sight, she took a step back, positioning herself closer to the door of her vehicle. She wasn't about to let this officer cross any more lines. "You're harassing me," she stated, her voice cutting through the tense air like a blade. "If you're going to search my vehicle, you need a warrant. Otherwise, I'm free to go." For a moment, the officers stood there in silence, both of them sizing Sarah up, trying to figure out how to handle someone who wasn't intimidated by their badges. The first officer seemed to lose his patience, his face flushing red with anger. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near his belt as he prepared to assert his authority once more. Sarah knew she had to stay calm. The next move was crucial. She had already pushed the officer to the edge, and now she could feel his desire to escalate things further. But she wouldn't back down. She wasn't just an ordinary driver on the side of the road. She was a trained officer, disciplined and ready to stand her ground. With her military background, Sarah had trained for moments like this. She knew how to read people, how to anticipate their next move. She wasn't going to let this officer make her the target of his misplaced power. She had been in life and death situations before, and this wasn't one of them, but it didn't make it any less important to stand up for herself. As she stood there, waiting for the officer to make his next move, she prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation. She had faced much more dangerous situations in her military career, and she wasn't about to let an officer with a misplaced sense of power dictate her actions. As Sarah remained composed, she could feel the weight of the situation escalating, though she was determined not to let the officer's anger rattle her. Officer Daniels, the one who had originally pulled her over, was visibly frustrated. He kept muttering to himself, glancing from his partner to Sarah as if looking for something to justify his actions. He was clearly not used to being challenged like this, especially by someone who wasn't intimidated by his authority. His earlier smirk was gone now, replaced by a look of annoyance. Sarah knew that at any moment, things could take a dangerous turn. With no clear reason for the stop and no probable cause to search her vehicle, this situation had no legal basis. But Daniels didn't seem to care. His grip on his radio tightened as he began to speak into it, calling for more backup. "I need a 1029 on the individual here. I'm not getting the cooperation I need," he said, his voice low but filled with frustration. As Sarah stood there, calmly waiting, she observed his every movement. She could tell that the more she refused to comply, the more Daniels was losing control of the situation. He had expected her to fold, to show fear, but that wasn't going to happen. Sarah had dealt with far worse during her time in the military, and this officer's petty power struggle wasn't going to intimidate her. The backup officer, who had initially seemed somewhat neutral, was now standing a few feet away, watching the exchange carefully. The shift in his stance told Sarah that he wasn't entirely comfortable with how the situation was being handled. But Daniels didn't seem to notice. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice now laced with thinly veiled hostility. "You're refusing to cooperate with a lawful officer," Daniels said, stepping forward as if he were expecting her to back down. "You're going to regret this." Sarah met his gaze head-on, unwavering. "I'm not refusing to cooperate, officer. I'm simply asking for you to follow the law. I haven't broken any laws and I haven't been told why I'm being detained. So unless you have a lawful reason, I'm not doing anything that violates my rights." The backup officer shifted uneasily, his eyes flicking back and forth between Sarah and Daniels. Sarah could tell that he wasn't entirely convinced by the way his colleague was handling the situation, but he wasn't going to speak up just yet. Daniels, however, seemed intent on escalating matters. He was desperate to assert his authority, to prove that he wasn't going to let Sarah get away with challenging him. "Do you know who I am?" Daniels asked, his tone turning condescending. "You should have just complied when I asked you to step out of the vehicle." "I'm Colonel Sarah Green, United States Army," Sarah replied, her voice steady and strong, each word punctuating the fact that she wasn't just some random civilian on the side of the road. "And you're treating me as if I'm a criminal. You've got no reason to be stopping me, and you certainly have no right to search my vehicle. If you have a problem with that, you can call your supervisor." The officer scoffed, looking her over in disbelief. "Oh, really? A colonel, huh? Sure, and I'm supposed to believe that." Sarah didn't flinch. She was used to being doubted, especially in situations like this. But she also knew how to play the game. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her ID, knowing that showing it would help back up her claim. But as her fingers moved through the fabric, she felt a slight panic rise in her chest when she realized that her military ID wasn't there. It wasn't in her blazer pocket. It wasn't in her wallet. She checked the other pocket of her blazer, but it was empty. Her military ID was gone. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think. The last time she had seen it was earlier that day when she changed out of her uniform at the base before the event. It was still at the locker. She hadn't thought to grab it, thinking she would be fine without it. Daniels noticed the brief pause in her movements, a smirk creeping back onto his face. "No military ID? What a surprise, how convenient. Looks like you're just another liar trying to avoid being caught. You're nothing but trouble." Sarah steadied herself, refusing to let him get to her. "I don't have my military ID on me right now, but I assure you, I'm Colonel Sarah Green, United States Army. You can verify my identity with your department. My record will confirm it." Daniel scoffed, shaking his head. "I'll believe it when I see it. You got no ID, no proof. What kind of colonel doesn't carry their military ID?" "I was in civilian clothes," Sarah said calmly, "and my military ID is back at the base, where I left it with my uniform. But you can call my department and verify it if you'd like. I'm not hiding anything from you." The officer didn't seem convinced. So you expect me to just take your word for it, huh? I don't think so. With a deep breath, Sarah stayed calm. She knew she had to stay in control of the situation. The more Daniels tried to escalate, the more she realized he was using his badge as a tool for intimidation, but it wasn't going to work on her. She wasn't afraid. The backup officer, who had remained quiet up until now, finally stepped forward. "Let's just call it in," he suggested, his tone less confrontational than Daniels. "Verify her identity, and we can get this over with." Daniels shot him a look, his pride clearly bruised. "We don't need to waste time on that. We can deal with this ourselves." But the backup officer was insistent. "It's the right thing to do, Daniels. If she's telling the truth, there's no reason not to." As the backup officer began speaking into his radio, Sarah watched Daniels. His hands were clenched, his jaw tight with frustration. He hadn't expected things to go this way. He had assumed she would crumble under pressure, but she hadn't. Now he was the one on the edge, and Sarah was waiting for him to make the next move. The silence that followed was tense, but Sarah remained unflinching. She wasn't backing down. As the minutes ticked by, the tension between Sarah and Officer Daniels only grew. The backup officer had now called for confirmation on her identity, but Daniels continued to act as though he could control the situation. He paced, his movements sharp, like an animal in a cage. Sarah remained calm, hands visible at all times, but her mind was already working through the next steps. She knew that at any moment this could escalate, but she had no intention of letting that happen. She had been trained for situations like this, and no matter how much Daniels tried to provoke her, she wouldn't let him succeed. Sarah's breath remained steady as she observed Daniels, watching his every move. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was desperate. The way his body language shifted told her that he was starting to lose his grip on control. This wasn't about the law anymore. It was about his bruised ego, his inability to intimidate her, to force her to react the way he expected, was chipping away at his sense of authority. It was a dangerous thing when someone like Daniels was pushed to the edge, and Sarah knew that she had to stay in control to avoid things getting out of hand. "I've already told you, I'm Colonel Sarah Green," Sarah said again, her voice unwavering, though she knew Daniels wasn't listening to her words anymore. He wasn't interested in the truth. "You can check with my department. There's no need for this charade." Daniels let out a scoff, clearly still trying to hold on to his position. "I don't need to check anything. I know what I'm dealing with. You're just trying to get out of this by claiming you're someone you're not." He shot a glance at his partner, who was still holding the radio, waiting for confirmation from their dispatch. Daniels couldn't seem to wait any longer. "I'm done waiting," he muttered. With a sudden, aggressive movement, Daniels took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. Sarah tensed for a moment, but she didn't back away. She stood her ground, meeting his gaze with an unflinching look. Daniels reached for the handle of her car, jerking it open without asking for permission, his actions deliberate and reckless. "You're not searching my vehicle without probable cause," Sarah said firmly, her voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade. "You have no right to do that." Daniels ignored her, pulling open the door of her car and starting to rifle through her belongings. His movements were quick, uncoordinated, as if he was hoping to find something, anything, that could justify his actions. He opened the glove compartment with a loud snap, scattering papers and personal items onto the passenger seat as he continued his search. The backup officer hesitated, looking between Sarah and Daniels, unsure how to proceed. It was clear that Daniels had crossed a line, but he wasn't willing to stop yet. "This is a violation of my rights," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "You can't search my vehicle just because you don't like me, Daniels. You don't have probable cause, and you know it." Daniels didn't respond. He continued to sift through her things, clearly frustrated that he hadn't found anything. Sarah could see the anger bubbling under his surface, his frustration boiling over as he pushed through her personal items with even more aggression. It was clear he wasn't interested in the law anymore. This was personal. This was about his authority, and Sarah was challenging it. "Maybe you've got a little business you're hiding," Daniels muttered, his voice low with disdain. "Maybe you're smuggling something in this car." Sarah clenched her jaw but didn't let her temper get the best of her. She had seen men like him before. Officers who used their badge as a tool of intimidation. Men who thought they could do whatever they wanted, as if the badge gave them the right to treat others however they saw fit. Sarah knew she had two options: escalate and risk everything, or step back and play the game with calm precision. And if there was one thing she was certain of, it was that Sarah Green didn't play to lose. "Stop harassing me, Daniels," she said, her voice quiet but filled with undeniable authority. "You're crossing the line." But Daniels, desperate to regain control, wasn't listening. He turned and began to rummage through the back seat, throwing her belongings aside with no regard. His attitude was one of entitlement. He expected her to just comply. He had the power, he thought. But Sarah wasn't just going to bend to his will. She was standing up, not just for herself, but for the countless people who had been abused by officers like him. Her mind was racing now. This was the moment. She had to handle this carefully. Daniels would keep pushing until he felt in control again, and she wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. But it was clear. He was escalating things, pushing her closer to a point where a single misstep could make everything fall apart. Daniels wasn't just trying to assert his authority, he was desperate, and desperation made people unpredictable. "Enough," Sarah said, her voice sharp now. She had reached the point where patience was no longer an option. "If you want to arrest me, go ahead. But you better have a reason, Daniels, because right now you've got nothing but a temper tantrum." Daniels didn't like being called out. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Colonel. I've asked you to step out of the car." "I already did that when you asked," Sarah shot back, her voice unwavering. "Now I'm asking you, what's the reason for all this? What is the real issue here?" Daniels faltered for a moment, his brow furrowing as if the question was finally starting to sink in. He didn't have a clear answer. He didn't need one. This wasn't about law anymore. It was about power. And for the first time, Sarah saw the cracks in his armor. The man in front of her wasn't an officer of the law anymore. He was just a man desperate to regain control, and it was clear he was willing to do whatever it took to achieve that. And that was where Sarah Green knew she had the advantage. As the confrontation between Sarah and Officer Daniels reached its boiling point, both of them stood frozen in the silent tension of the empty highway. The flashing lights from the patrol car behind them bathed the scene in red and blue hues, casting long shadows on the asphalt as Sarah remained standing firm, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders like an unspoken challenge. Officer Daniels had crossed so many lines now that Sarah could almost feel the shift in his energy. He was no longer operating with the quiet authority of a seasoned officer, but with the frantic, reckless desperation of a man who had realized he had made a grave mistake. Daniels seemed to hesitate for a split second, the faintest flicker of doubt creeping into his posture. But just as quickly he pushed forward, his hand grabbing for his radio, trying to maintain his composure. His voice was sharp, urgent as he called for backup, signaling his belief that he still had control. But the tightness in his voice betrayed his growing fear. The fact that Sarah wasn't reacting the way he expected, wasn't cowering or apologizing, seemed to be gnawing at him, fraying the very edges of his authority. "I'm not doing this with you, Daniels," Sarah said, her voice calm but stern, cutting through the tension like a sword. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins, her military training kicking in. "You don't have probable cause to search my vehicle, and you don't have a right to detain me any longer. You can call for all the backup you want, but this isn't going anywhere for you." For a moment, Daniels froze, his fingers hovering over the radio as though weighing the option of backing down. His gaze flicked between Sarah's face and her car, his thoughts racing. The situation was spiraling out of his control, and the knowledge that he might have made a fatal error was starting to sink in. He had always been one to believe that his badge gave him the ultimate power, that no one would challenge him, especially not someone like Sarah. But here she was, unshaken, unbowed, and not playing by the rules he had come to rely on. This wasn't a simple traffic stop anymore. This was a battle of wills, and he had underestimated the woman standing before him. Daniels was no longer thinking logically. His pride and arrogance had clouded his judgment, and the more he tried to reassert himself, the more it became clear that he wasn't going to win. He couldn't back down now, not after everything he had done. But even as he took another step forward, eyes narrowing with renewed determination, Sarah stayed rooted in place. She had been trained for moments like this, moments when intimidation was the weapon, when authority was wielded not for protection, but for power. She had seen it all before, and she knew exactly what this was, a man who had nothing left to lose. "You've made a big mistake, Daniels," Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that cut through the chaos of the moment. She took a slow, deliberate step closer to him, her eyes locked on his. "You don't get to decide how this ends. You don't get to control the narrative anymore." For a split second, Daniels faltered, and Sarah could see it in his eyes. The realization that his grip on the situation was slipping. His hand clenched into a fist, and his jaw tightened. But Sarah wasn't afraid. She was ready. The silence between them was deafening, each second stretching out, but Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her react. She knew what was coming next. Daniels, his patience finally worn thin, made a decision. With a sharp, angry gesture, he reached for the radio again, calling for backup with even more urgency. His voice cracked with frustration as he made the call, clearly hoping that reinforcements would give him the backup he needed to regain control. Sarah could almost feel his pulse quicken, his desperation growing with every passing second. It was no longer about the law, it was about his ego, his need to prove that he still had the upper hand. But Sarah didn't move. She didn't react to the urgency in his voice. Instead, she took another breath, her pulse steady, her thoughts clear. The situation was escalating quickly, but she refused to be baited into reacting impulsively. The last thing Daniels wanted was for her to show fear or hesitation, so she made a choice. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "I'm done here," Sarah said firmly, her tone unyielding. "I've been patient, but you've crossed the line. I'm not going to let you intimidate me anymore." Daniels scoffed, clearly frustrated that his usual tactics weren't working. "You think you won? You think just because you've been polite that I'll just let you go?" His voice was dripping with venom now, the mask of professionalism slipping away. He took a step closer, invading her personal space in a way that would have made anyone else back down. But not Sarah. She didn't flinch. Without warning, Daniels made a grab for her arm, a sudden, aggressive move that seemed to catch her off guard. But Sarah's instincts were sharp, and she reacted in the split second it took him to close the gap. She stepped back, her body shifting with calculated precision, just out of his reach. "That's not going to work, Daniels," Sarah said coldly, her eyes narrowing as she faced him. "You're pushing me, but you won't win. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. This is your last chance to walk away." The words hit Daniels like a ton of bricks. He had never expected someone to stand up to him like this, especially not someone who outranked him in every way. He hesitated, staring at Sarah as though he couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be the one backed into a corner, unsure of what to do next. But there was no more room for doubt. He had pushed too far, and now there was only one way this could end. Sarah wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to be the one to blink. The silence hung in the air for a long, torturous moment. Sarah knew it was over. She had done everything she could to keep control of the situation, and now all that was left was to wait for Daniels to realize the inevitable. He was finished. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost inaudible. "I don't think I can let you go." Without hesitation, Sarah answered, her voice as steady as ever. "You don't have a choice." In that instant, the realization dawned on Daniels. There was nothing he could do. He had lost. The consequences of his actions were about to catch up to him, and there would be no escape. As Sarah stood there, her mind already processing the events that had transpired, she knew the storm wasn't quite over. Officer Daniels had crossed the line. His behavior wasn't just a mistake, it was an act of authority taken too far, and it had escalated to the point where she couldn't back down. The situation wasn't just about her anymore. It had become a fight for something greater, for justice, for those who were powerless, for those who had suffered silently at the hands of officers who abused their power. Daniels had made his choice when he decided to confront her, but now the consequences were beginning to unfold. She watched as Daniels' demeanor shifted. His arrogance, which had been his shield all along, was now slipping away. The facade of control he had held onto so tightly was cracking. The anger in his eyes was still there, but it was no longer directed at her. Now it was turning inward. He had miscalculated. His hands trembled slightly, his face flushed, and he avoided making direct eye contact with her. There was fear in him now, the kind of fear that comes when you realize you're no longer the one in control. At that moment, the familiar sound of approaching sirens filled the air. It was the sound that had been building ever since the initial confrontation, but now, with Daniels backing down and Sarah's resolve stronger than ever, the sirens weren't a signal of a fresh wave of trouble. They were the sound of justice coming to claim its due. Sarah felt a surge of relief wash over her. She had done everything she could to hold her ground, to make sure Daniels understood that no matter how much power he thought he wielded, he was no match for the truth. The truth always finds a way to break through, no matter how thick the walls of denial or self-righteousness are. The moment the backup arrived, Sarah knew there was no turning back for Daniels. He had tried to manipulate the situation, tried to use his badge to overpower her, but now his actions were going to be scrutinized, and there would be no escaping the consequences. Two patrol cars pulled up with a screech, tires grinding against the road as they came to a sharp stop. Officers rushed out, their uniforms crisp, their movements efficient, the gravity of the moment clearly visible in their faces. Sarah stood back, watching, waiting. She knew this moment would be critical, and it would be up to the officers to recognize the truth. One officer, a sergeant with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Sarah first. His eyes flicked over her calmly, quickly assessing the situation. He then turned to Daniels and his face hardened, a look of recognition crossing his features. Sarah could see the wheels turning in the officer's mind, the internal conflict between what he had been taught to do and the reality of what Daniels had actually done. "Colonel Carter?" the sergeant said, his tone clipped but respectful. Sarah nodded, the authority in her stance unmistakable. The sergeant's eyes moved between Daniels, still slumped against the car, his face red with frustration, and Sarah standing with unwavering composure. "This man," Sarah began, her voice cold but measured, "attacked me. He attempted to run me off the road, and when I defended myself, he escalated the situation further." She didn't need to explain everything. The facts were clear enough. The officer, after a brief pause, turned to his team. "Cuff him," the sergeant ordered. His voice left no room for negotiation, no room for Daniels to twist his way out of this. Two officers approached Daniels without hesitation, their hands moving quickly, expertly, cuffing him to the sound of clinking metal. Daniels, still trying to maintain some semblance of authority, tried to pull away, but his body language betrayed him. His shoulders sagged, his posture defeated. No amount of resistance could undo what had already been done. The man who had once thought himself untouchable was now on the ground, his future no longer in his hands but in the hands of those who had seen through his lies. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't need to watch Daniels being cuffed. She didn't need the satisfaction of seeing his humiliation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And the system, for once, was working as it should. Daniels would be held accountable for his actions, just as anyone else would. As Daniels was escorted toward one of the patrol cars, his face twisted with resentment and humiliation, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of victory. It wasn't a sweet, satisfying victory. It wasn't a triumph over a singular man. It was a quiet, determined victory for every person who had been wronged by officers like him, who had seen their voices ignored, their rights trampled. The system might have failed them before, but it was finally functioning as it was meant to. It was a reminder that no one, not even those with badges, was above the law. Sarah turned and walked back to her car, her steps deliberate and steady. She didn't need to hear what Daniel said under his breath as he was being led away. She didn't need to hear his hollow words of defiance, which were only the last gasp of a man who had been defeated by his own arrogance. She had done what she needed to do. She had fought not just for herself, but for every person who had been pushed down by the weight of unchecked power. She couldn't change the past, but she could shape the future. And the future, at least in this moment, felt just a little bit brighter. The battle was over, but the war for justice had just begun. As the weeks passed, The consequences of Officer Daniels' actions continued to unfold in ways he had never anticipated. Once a man with an air of untouchable authority, Daniels was now facing a whirlwind of public scrutiny, internal investigations, and, most importantly, the collapse of his career. The department he had once proudly served under now turned its back on him, and his name became a stain on the reputation of law enforcement. His actions, which he had convinced himself were justified, were now being exposed for what they truly were: a misuse of power, an abuse of authority, and a blatant disregard for the law. The first blow to Daniels came swiftly. The department suspended him indefinitely, and Internal Affairs began a thorough investigation into his conduct. As news of his actions spread, support for Daniels dwindled to nothing. Officers who had once been his colleagues, who had admired his ability to intimidate and command, now distanced themselves from him. Those who had once laughed along with him in the break room now whispered behind his back, their loyalties shifting as the weight of the evidence against him became undeniable. Daniels had once walked with pride, holding his badge like a shield, but now that same badge was a target. The public backlash was swift and severe. The media outlets, which had previously glorified police officers in positions of power, now painted Daniels as a rogue cop, a man who had betrayed his oath and violated the very trust the public had placed in him. Headlines flashed across newspapers, websites, and TV screens. Officer under investigation for attempted vehicular homicide. Police officer faces charges of abuse of power, and ex-cop's history of misconduct exposed. Daniels, once revered, was now vilified. His life, once defined by authority and control, was crumbling before his eyes. For Sarah, this was just the beginning. The victory she had achieved on the road was a small part of the greater battle she was fighting. She knew that men like Daniels, those who abused their power, rarely accepted the consequences without trying to slip through the cracks. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. She had already taken steps to ensure that Daniels wouldn't be able to bury his past, to reinvent himself, or to manipulate the system once again. No, Sarah wasn't going to let him fade into the background. The next phase of the battle came with the filing of a civil lawsuit. Sarah wasn't content with seeing Daniels merely suspended or terminated. She knew that if she didn't act, Daniels would find another way back into a position of power, perhaps as a private security consultant or through connections that might allow him to continue his abusive behavior. She couldn't let that happen. Sarah filed charges for assault, attempted vehicular homicide, and reckless endangerment. Clear, irrefutable actions that Daniels had committed that day on the highway. But more than that, she wanted to make sure that Daniels would never again be able to use his badge to intimidate, to control, to hurt others. The legal process was slow but sure. As Daniels' history of misconduct was unveiled, Sarah's case grew stronger. It turned out that Daniels wasn't just a rogue cop with a single misstep. His history was filled with complaints, accusations of racial profiling, excessive force, and intimidation. All of those complaints had been buried beneath a layer of bureaucracy, dismissed as isolated incidents, and swept under the rug. Now, with the public's eye on him, those complaints couldn't be ignored. Daniels was no longer just a cop gone rogue. He was a symbol of a deeper, systemic problem within the force. But Daniels, true to form, refused to admit defeat. Instead, he dug in his heels, tried to play the victim, and claimed that he had been wrongly accused. He spun a narrative that cast him as the hero, the one who was simply trying to do his job, while Sarah became the villain who had forced him into a situation where he had no choice but to act. This was, of course, the same narrative he had tried to sell when he stopped Sarah on that lonely stretch of highway. He had been the one in control, and when his authority was challenged, he lashed out. It was a predictable story, but it didn't work anymore. The facts were out, and they painted a very different picture. The trial began with a sense of anticipation in the air. The public had been waiting for this moment, waiting to see if the justice system would finally hold one of its own accountable. As the trial proceeded, Daniels' defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence against him. Sarah took the stand with calm determination, detailing the events of that fateful day and the trauma that followed. Her testimony was clear, composed, and unwavering. She wasn't here for vengeance. She was here to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had, that Daniels wouldn't have the chance to hurt anyone again. But the real shock came when the internal investigations and testimony from fellow officers were presented. It was undeniable. Daniel's history of misconduct was laid bare for everyone to see. The jury saw it. The judge saw it. The courtroom, filled with people who had been watching this case closely, saw it too. This wasn't just a single bad act. It was a pattern of abuse, one that had been allowed to persist for far too long. As Daniel sat there, his head hung low, his world began to collapse. The moment had come, and there was no escaping the consequences now. He had thought he could control the situation, manipulate the narrative, and walk away unscathed. But Sarah, standing strong, had ensured that his actions would no longer go unchecked. It was over. Daniels was going to pay for what he had done, and the message was clear. No one, not even those in positions of power, was above the law. The tension in the courtroom had been building for days. The eyes of the public were fixed firmly on the trial, with every major media outlet covering it, their cameras capturing every moment, every exchange. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't just a simple case. It was a symbol, a turning point, a chance for justice to not just be served, but to be seen to be served. Daniels, who had once worn his badge with pride, was now a defendant, fighting not just for his freedom, but for his reputation, his career, and his sense of control. He was a man who had lost everything, and in that courtroom, he was about to lose even more. The prosecution had presented its case with meticulous precision, laying out the events of the traffic stop, the escalation that followed, and the unlawful search of Sarah's vehicle. The dash cam footage from Sarah's SUV, captured in vivid detail, showed everything. Daniel's aggressive behavior, his unwarranted demands, and his escalating attempts to assert control over the situation. There was no hiding the truth. Each piece of evidence, each statement from witnesses, only made Daniels look worse. He tried at every turn to defend himself, to justify his actions, but nothing seemed to stick. The more he spoke, the more he dug himself deeper into a hole. Sarah sat at the front of the courtroom, calm and collected, her gaze steady and unwavering. She had been through this before, not in a courtroom, but in her military career, where every decision, every action could have life or death consequences. What Daniels didn't realize was that his threats, his manipulation, had no effect on her. She was a trained leader, someone who had been tested in high-pressure situations. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was a battle for justice, and she was going to win. The moment Sarah took the witness stand, the room fell silent. The prosecutor asked her to recount the events of that day, the unlawful stop, the questioning, and the aggressive behavior that followed. Sarah spoke clearly, with precision, detailing every moment without hesitation. She explained how Daniels had targeted her, questioning her military status in a condescending manner, and how he had escalated the situation unnecessarily. Her testimony was the turning point in the trial. With each word, Daniels' defense seemed less and less plausible. The evidence didn't lie, and the jury knew it. But even as Sarah's testimony built a rock-solid case, Daniels remained defiant. His anger, once concealed behind a badge, now bubbled to the surface. He sat there in the courtroom, his jaw clenched, his fist gripping the arms of his chair, as if he could still control the situation. He shot Sarah occasional glares, his eyes burning with resentment. But it was clear to everyone now, he wasn't in control anymore. He had already lost. The final blow came when the defense tried to argue that Daniels had been acting in accordance with his training, that he had been protecting himself and doing his job. But Sarah's response was precise and devastating. She pointed out that his behavior had gone far beyond what was necessary for self-defense or law enforcement. His actions were fueled by pride, by a desire to assert his authority over her. She made it clear that this wasn't about a bad day or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a pattern of behavior. And that pattern, which had been buried for so long, had come to light. The prosecution's case had laid out every piece of evidence, every wrong move Daniels had made. Now all that was left was for the jury to deliberate. The weight of the moment was palpable. People held their breath, waiting to see if the justice system would finally hold a law enforcement officer accountable for his actions. As Daniels sat there, knowing the evidence against him was overwhelming. He could feel the walls closing in. The arrogance that had once defined him had all but disappeared. He was no longer the man who had used his badge as a weapon. He was a man facing the consequences of his actions. His future, once filled with promise and control, was now slipping away. There was nothing he could do to stop it. Finally, the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces grim. The judge called the room to order, and the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The jury foreperson stood and handed the verdict to the judge, who glanced at it briefly before looking up. "Guilty," the judge declared. Daniels froze. The weight of those words hit him harder than anything he had experienced before. He had been convicted, not just of one crime, but of the very abuse of power that had shaped his entire career. His arrogance, his belief that he was above the law, had led him here, and now there was no escape. As the bailiffs moved in to take him into custody, Daniel's shoulders slumped. His once proud posture, the one that had demanded respect and submission, was now gone. The man who had once wielded his badge like a weapon was now a convicted felon, facing the reality of his actions. Sarah, standing at the front of the courtroom, watched the scene unfold without a flicker of triumph or malice. She had done what needed to be done. Justice had been served, and Daniels had been held accountable for his abuse of power. For Sarah, it was over. She had faced down a man who thought he could control her, and she had won. But she knew the fight was never truly over. There were always more battles to fight, more people to protect, more justice to seek, and she would be ready for whatever came next. As the days following the trial unfolded, the consequences of Daniel's actions rippled throughout the entire police department. The news spread quickly, making headlines in every local and national outlet. His fall from grace was nothing short of public spectacle. The once proud officer who had used his badge as a symbol of authority was now the embodiment of disgrace. The officers who had once blindly supported him were now backing away, distancing themselves from the man whose actions had shamed the very institution he had once sworn to protect. The first indication that Daniels was truly alone came when his phone rang late one evening. It was a call from a fellow officer, a man he had considered a close friend during his years on the force. The man was blunt, no pleasantries, just the cold truth. Daniels was finished. No department would hire him now. His reputation had been completely tarnished, and the few who had once been willing to overlook his past indiscretions were now distancing themselves in order to save their own careers. Within a few days, the police union, which had once been Daniel's staunch defender, issued a public statement disavowing him. The union, under pressure from both the public and other officers who felt betrayed by his actions, had no choice but to sever ties with him. Daniel's name, once synonymous with a badge of honor, was now associated with abuse of power, racial profiling, and excessive force. For Daniels, this was the harshest reality of all. He had lived his life believing that his position in law enforcement granted him a sense of superiority. He had used his badge to control others, to instill fear, and to intimidate those who crossed his path. But now, in the wake of his conviction, he realized just how fragile that sense of power had been. It had been a mirage, built on the assumption that he could never be touched, that he could never face the consequences of his actions. Now, with every door closed to him, the weight of his choices bore down on him in a way he had never anticipated. Back in the courtroom, the aftermath of the trial was being felt. The judge had handed down a sentence that left no room for leniency. Daniels was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for attempted vehicular homicide, aggravated assault, and abuse of power under the color of law. The severity of the sentence shocked many, but it was precisely what the system needed to demonstrate that even those who wore badges of authority could not escape accountability when they abused their power. Sarah, however, felt no sense of vindication. For her, the outcome was simply the justice that had been long overdue. She had never sought the spotlight, nor did she care for public recognition. What mattered to her was the fact that Daniels would never again have the chance to use his badge to hurt others, to terrorize those who were powerless in front of him. Justice had been served, but the road ahead was still filled with challenges. Though the trial had been a pivotal moment in her life, Sarah didn't dwell on it. She didn't celebrate Daniel's fall, Nor did she take pleasure in his downfall. The victory wasn't hers alone. It was a collective win for all those who had been victims of a systemic abuse, for those who had been silenced by the very people meant to protect them. The fight for justice was ongoing, and Sarah knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. In the weeks that followed, Sarah received messages of support from fellow service members, friends, and even strangers who had followed the case. The Pentagon issued a formal statement commending her for her professionalism throughout the ordeal, and her commanding officers reached out to express their respect. But even as the public recognition came, Sarah remained focused on the work at hand. She knew there would always be another battle, another injustice to face, and as long as she was standing, she would continue to fight for what was right. Daniels, meanwhile, found himself in a cell, his life unrecognizable from the man he once was. The prison walls closed in around him, not just physically, but psychologically. Every day he relived the mistakes he had made, the moment he had pushed too far, the arrogance that had led him to think he could get away with anything. Now there was nothing left for him but time. Time to reflect on his failure, time to come to terms with the man he had become, and time to face the consequences of his own actions. For Sarah, justice had been served, but she knew it was only the beginning. There would always be more men like Daniels, those who thought the law didn't apply to them, those who used their power to break others. But as long as she had breath in her lungs, she would continue to fight, for herself, for others, and for the justice that would one day prevail. In the wake of Daniel's conviction and the fallout from his actions, the world around Sarah began to return to some semblance of normality. The media coverage that had once dominated the news cycle gradually faded, replaced by new stories and new scandals. Yet for Sarah, the reality of what she had endured settled deep into her bones. The trial was over, Daniels was behind bars, and the justice that had eluded so many had finally been served. But the cost had been steep, and though she had emerged victorious, there was no real sense of closure. Sarah didn't celebrate the outcome. She didn't feel the need to bask in the public recognition that came her way. The constant messages of support from fellow service members, veterans, and even strangers who had followed the case were kind, but they didn't change anything. The most important thing to her was knowing that Daniels had been held accountable for his abuse of power. His reputation was ruined, and his future was bleak. He would never again have the ability to harm anyone under the color of law. The weeks following the trial brought a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Sarah returned to her duties with the same discipline and focus she had always maintained. She had been through war zones, high-stakes military operations, and personal trials that would have broken many. But this fight for justice, had been different. The toll it had taken on her was not just physical, it had been emotional too. She had faced an adversary who wielded the power of the state, who used his position to intimidate and control. But she had fought back, not out of anger or hatred, but out of a deep sense of right and wrong. Yet even as Sarah resumed her work, she knew the larger battle for justice was far from over. Daniels might have been one officer, one instance of abuse, but the systemic issues that allowed people like him to thrive were much larger. His story was just one of many that had been swept under the rug, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and silence. And Sarah, despite everything she had gone through, was determined not to let the system continue to protect those who used their badges for power rather than service. For Daniels, life in prison was a far cry from the world he once inhabited. The same power and control that had defined his career had been replaced by the cold, unyielding reality of incarceration. He would spend the next 15 years of his life locked away, stripped of everything he had once taken for granted. His career, his reputation, and most importantly, his sense of authority. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless, and that realization was harder to bear than any physical punishment he could have imagined. As for Sarah, the fight wasn't about the recognition or the accolades. It was about ensuring that men like Daniels could never again hide behind their badges and cause harm. She had already seen how the system protected those in power, and she knew that her victory over Daniels was only a small step in a much larger journey. The world was full of officers who abused their power, who believed that their badges made them untouchable, and Sarah knew that her fight had to continue. With Daniels behind bars and her mission for justice complete, Sarah felt a rare sense of peace settle within her, but she also knew that there would always be more work to do. As she moved forward, she did so with the understanding that change was a constant battle, one that she would always be ready to face. As the months passed, the impact of Sarah's fight against Daniels continued to ripple through the community and beyond. News of his conviction spread to every corner of the country, stirring up a conversation about abuse of power, racial profiling, and the unyielding struggle for justice. Daniels had been an embodiment of the unchecked power that so many in law enforcement had wielded for years, but Sarah had shown the world that power could be challenged, even by those who seemed untouchable. Her actions inspired others to come forward, share their stories, and seek justice for the wrongs they had endured. Veterans, civilians, and fellow service members who had been victims of similar abuses by officers in positions of power now found the courage to speak out. They were no longer afraid to stand up, knowing that someone like Sarah had fought for them and prevailed. This was Sarah's greatest victory. Her personal battle had ignited a larger movement for change. But despite the positive momentum, the battle was far from over. The legal system, with its flaws and slow-moving processes, still held many obstacles for victims of police brutality and misconduct. The media, quick to report sensational headlines when stories like Daniels hit the news, soon moved on to the next scandal, leaving many of the affected individuals without the support or spotlight they deserved. But Sarah knew that true change would not come from temporary media attention or one-off cases. It would require sustained effort, deep institutional reform, and a community-wide commitment to holding those in power accountable. Daniels, in contrast, found himself struggling to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. The high-profile trial, once thought to be his ticket to a swift resolution, had spiraled into an unrelenting storm of scandal. The more the public learned about his history of abuse, the more his reputation crumbled. His former colleagues in the police force, once so eager to turn a blind eye to his behavior, now distanced themselves. The department, which had quietly protected him for years, could no longer afford to ignore the damage his actions had done to its credibility. In prison, Daniels faced the brutal reality of his downfall. His position of authority had been replaced with isolation, as his fellow inmates made their own judgments about him. The man who had once walked with the arrogance of someone above reproach now found himself stripped of everything. No longer was he a police officer with a badge and a gun. He was simply another prisoner, another statistic in a broken system. As his time behind bars stretched on, Daniels had no choice but to reflect on the choices he had made, the power he had abused, and the lives he had harmed. But the damage was done. For all his regrets, nothing could undo the harm he had caused or change the fact that he had lost everything: his career, his freedom, and his dignity. Sarah, on the other hand, quietly continued her work, knowing that while one victory had been won, the war was still ongoing. She was determined to see real change in the systems that allowed men like Daniels to thrive. The road ahead was long, but the lessons from her battle, never back down, never compromise on justice, were lessons she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The story of Sarah and Daniels offers powerful lessons that resonate far beyond the courtroom. One of the most important messages is that standing up for what is right, even when faced with immense adversity, can bring about real change. Sarah's unwavering commitment to justice, despite the systemic obstacles in her way, shows that individual actions can challenge ingrained systems of power and bring accountability. It teaches us that integrity and courage are not just virtues, but necessary tools for those who seek to create a fairer world. Another valuable lesson is the importance of self-reflection. Daniel's downfall was not just the result of his actions, but also his inability to recognize his mistakes and make amends. It's a reminder that no one is above reproach, and we must all be willing to learn from our errors, regardless of our position in life. For those of us who are older, this story reminds us that it's never too late to stand up for justice and make a difference. Whether it's in our communities, our families, or our daily lives, we can still challenge injustice and set an example for others to follow. I encourage you to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever faced an injustice and found the courage to speak out? If so, I'd love to hear your story. Please share it in the comments below, and let's continue to support each other in making the world a better place.